they need M16s and
Surprise,
all
surprise,
this here.
surprise.
And that's under one of the blogs on Jarrett Law. And they actually have the law and the phone numbers to call. And that just came down.
Well. So anything else? We're going to move on actually to the economic powers of Congress. Which is,
I just have one
Go ahead.
question. If the Army, the standing militia, was only supposed to be in effect for 2 years and serve for 6 months, under the weapon systems that we have today, how could you even learn anything in 6 months?
Oh, no, you'd be under training. You, in other words, your National Guard, the state National Guard that we have right here, goes once a month for what they call training. In other words, they have a report for an entire weekend. During that period of time, they're being trained up in this weaponry and all these systems and what have you.
Well, everything I heard about the National Guard, it took them a long time, like in the Second World War, it took them a long time to get up to speed.
Oh, yeah.
So that I can't, to me, it doesn't sound like you can train somebody on a 6-month basis to protect our country with the type of weaponry that we have today.
Deployed for 6 months. You have to go through a 3 to 4, maybe 6 year. Actually, you have an 8-year commitment. And during that period of time, your particular MOS or your training code, you'll be trained.
In the Navy, so I understand.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm just concerned about
sure.
what the situation would be if you say it's a 2-year gig and you're only going to serve 6 months in the service. I mean,
No, 6 months deployed.
I mean, 6 months
deployed overseas.
Yeah.
Okay, let me throw something out here. The real issue at stake is whether we follow the Constitution or not. If we find that, I mean, we should have the discussion, is this workable nowadays? And if it isn't workable, then we should modify the Constitution. The point is, if you don't have the authority in the Constitution, you can't do it regardless of whether it's necessary within what modern weapon system.
And again,
Well, that's my thought, because it is necessary to defend ourselves, especially against...
And someone needs to modify the Constitution rather than just trample over it.
Right. So again, like the Navy, like the modern interpretation of that would be provide and maintain for the current Navy, the current Air Force, and the current Marines. That's pretty much how I would read it.
Okay.
And it just kind of comes down in some ways to formality, but again, like defending the borders was kind of left actually.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Doesn't the governor have, I think I saw it in the Pennsylvania Constitution, have some authority over the militia?
Oh, I believe so on the state level for sure.
Right.
And
So
what's kind of in here.
precede federal?
No, you can call out the National Guard, like if there's riots at colleges, or, you know, they've done that, like out in Ohio, they have the National Guard out there.
Yeah, for Kent State, yeah.
You know, and you know, what happened in Ohio, but they can call out the National Guard in times of strife within their own state.
Okay, but I wasn't really thinking of that. I was thinking more of if the president does what he's been doing and wouldn't then, in a way of breaking the chain of command, our governor say, no, forget it, you're not taking our people to...
Well, of course, that would be better, and that was kind of what, when they set this up, like the militia, again, it would be all citizens of the same state. So, again, like when, back in those days, we were pretty much a citizen of Pennsylvania. And it was only actually, I think, the 14th Amendment or something where they actually kind of created this federal citizen. So people like, you know, and if you go back to those times, like a Virginian, they were very, you know, they were pretty separate. You know, you had your people from Massachusetts, you had your New Yorkers, you had your Pennsylvania folks, and they would defend, you know, pretty much their state, but they realized that if they didn't band together to help protect against, you know, Europe, then they could get maybe picked off one by one.
Okay,
So most of the time, yeah.
Just
So
thinking of federal and what's happening now.
yeah,
Can't
again.
that be broken?
Well, the president has to make a case. The president has to make a case to the governor of the state, that he wants to, you know, take those troops from.
See, but that's just a formality nowadays. Up until the Civil War, yes, the states did 100%. They superseded the federal government. The federal government was constantly up into the 30s, up into the 50s even, but most openly in the 30s, where states were saying, hey, you know, we're getting out of this if you guys are going to keep pulling this stuff. And then the federal government would go, no, please don't, and begging them. That's the way the federal government's supposed to be doing, begging the states to keep supporting their agenda, as opposed to saying this is the way it's going to be. But Lincoln said, you know, well, the federal government's king. We will smash you, kill you, destroy everything you own, unless you do our will. So it totally flips the whole thing upside down. So nowadays the federal government does, through precedent, through everything, the money, yeah, they have total control.
It was kind of interesting, if you actually go back and study the Civil War, which would be a good example of what was actually occurring here, the states of South Carolina and Florida seceded from the Union. Like, they were out of the Union for several months, and the rest of the South was kind of teetering. And the reason, actually, for the whole debate, a lot of the things that they teach in schools today was about slavery, and that was a factor, but it actually came down to the tariffs that were in place at the time. And when Europe was importing goods, the North wanted to have a 50% tariff, and the South wanted to have a 10% tariff. And the end result is, if there was a 50% tariff involved, then the South couldn't get to the foreign goods, so they would buy everything from the industrial North. So they had like these corporate interests in New York and elsewhere that were kind of trying to set things up. But when these states broke away, everyone's familiar with the name Fort Sumter. It was in Charleston Harbor, and I think the fort in main city of Florida was Fort Pinckney. But they were actually federal forts. So the way they actually had it set up was, in Charleston, or in South Carolina and Florida, they had their state militia, which later became the Confederate Army, and for each state, and they had these federal forts that were, pretty much trying to, protect the harbor and the seaways and that type of thing. And there was a whole thing that evolved, really. Lincoln eventually reinforced Fort Sumter, which was taken as an act of war, and then the whole Civil War started. So it's, again, yeah, in theory, I would say, absolutely correct. In practicality, it is a bit different these days because of the way that they've been kind of mixing up the Army together. Like today, a lot of our, some of the silly things is, like, for instance, some of the people that have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, their regiments, their battalions aren't even based in the U.S. They're based in Italy, or they're based out of Germany. And they're just, the 55th out of Germany or what have you. And obviously they're from all different states in the United States. So, go ahead.
Part of what was happening when you were talking about the tariffs and stuff,
Yeah.
it had to do with cotton. That was the biggest cash crop down there, and the South wanted to be able to sell it directly to England. Because England would give them a better price than the northern mills would give them.
Right.
So the price put the 50% tariff on there, which meant that England had to pay 50% more for the cotton. Thereby, they couldn't buy it from the U.S., so they had no choice but to sell it to the Northerners, who were,
No, you're right.
give
You're right.
it
It
to
was
them.
basically a trade
It
war.
was a battle between the big bankers and the trade between the North and the South, and the South wanted to be able to sell its cotton for what it should rightfully be able to get for a price. It was getting tired of being told by the North, hey, this is all we're paying you for, take it or leave it, and you ain't selling it anywhere else either.
Yeah. So let's move on to the economic powers. And actually what the government does these days, people are familiar, but the healthcare involvement actually isn't a new thing. They've been involved with healthcare through the Medicaid, Medicare plan since the 60s, the HMO Act in the 1970s. The federal government also, actually, believe it or not, they regulate how many gallons you can flush in your toilet. They regulate light bulbs. I'm not making this up, too. Like, you can look up the EPA laws. They say, I think it's like 1.6 gallons per flush and that type of thing, which has all types of weird, unknown effects. But they also regulate the financial industry. They regulate the banks.